any possible prosecution. And of course, any comments on the King or the heir apparent would also not be in order. Right, we now come to the opposition day motion, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Now then, I think it's changed to Sir Ed Davey, a different name than I've got here. Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your statement ahead of this debate. The appalling crimes of Jeffrey Epstein and his associates have rightly stunned the whole world. The scale of Epstein's operation was shocking, selling human beings for sex, turning hundreds of young women and girls into victims and survivors. And it is those women who are at the front of our minds today as we finally seek transparency, truth and accountability. Mr. Speaker, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor shamed our country and the royal family. But for too long, members of Parliament were barred from even raising criticisms of him, let alone properly scrutinising his role as trade envoy. Because of the outdated tradition that mentions of any member of the royal family in this House must, in the words of the previous Speaker, be, and I quote, very rare, very sparing and very respectful. I encountered this firsthand back in 2011 when I was asked to respond to an adjournment debate on behalf of Lord Green, who was then the Minister for Trade and Investment. The adjournment was brought by the late Paul Flynn. But even he, an ardent and outspoken Republican, as I'm sure many of us remember, wasn't allowed to raise any actual concerns about Andrew himself. Paul called it a negative privilege, and that's what it was. He said his mouth was bandaged by archaic rules, and that had very real and damaging consequences. And I'm pleased to see the Minister in his place, because I know he was also constrained by those rules when he raised similar issues. And in that debate, Epstein's name wasn't even mentioned once. There was no chance to debate the substance. And standing in for the responsible minister, I set out the government's position as it had been for a decade, in support of the Prince's role as the trade envoy. Looking back, and knowing what we all know now, I'm horrified by it. I can't imagine what it must have been like for the survivors and their families to hear Andrew praised like that, as they heard so often all around the world. So I apologise to them, and I'm determined to change things. Mr. Speaker, I was struck by the words of Amanda Roberts, Virginia Giuffre's sister-in-law, after Andrew was arrested last week. She said this could be a stain on the royal family for the rest of our history, or, quote, it could be a moment where they and we decide that this is the time when cultural change happens. And as a staunch supporter of His Royal Highness the King and the royal family, I believe we must help to bring about that cultural change now.
Would you give way?
Happy to give way.
I'm most grateful to the leader of the Liberal Democrats for giving way. He's making a powerful speech. I'm sure we'll agree that decades of deferential, frankly sycophantic treatment by Parliament and state authorities are being exposed as having enabled Andrew Mountbatten Windsor to behave as though he were untouchable. Yep. And I'm sure he will join me in calling on the government to introduce independent oversight of those members of the royal family who undertake official duties and require both transparency and scrutiny over anything from now on paid for by the state, because apparently they work for us.
I'm grateful for that intervention. We must build a culture of transparency and accountability. I think that is essential. And I hope we as a House will look at ending the archaic negative privilege rules Paul Flynn spoke about. Remove the bandages from our mouths. And today, free of those bandages in relation to Andrew, our motion focuses on finally getting the truth out about his role as Special Representative for Trade and Investment.
Give way?
I'll give way again.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, can I commend the right honourable member for bringing, and his party for bringing this forward? Commend him for the way that he interviewed on TV this morning. And certainly, he doesn't just speak for this House, he speaks for this nation. And we're all greatly shocked at what has taken place, but does he agree as well? King Charles, Queen Camilla, Edward, Sophie, William, Kate, are members of the royal family at this time who also need our support. And does he agree that perhaps maybe now is a time to tell them that we in this House love them, that this nation loves them, and that we understand the pain that they're suffering, and our support is with those members of the royal family who are above this and above this reproach?
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman's intervention. I think he probably speaks for the whole House. And indeed, the intention of this debate is to bring this House together. And the changes that we think are necessary would indeed protect the royal family and strengthen the monarchy, which in some places is being criticised. And I think it's important, and that's why we need these reforms. But, Mr. Speaker, if I can go back to the motion, because it focuses at the start of this at the appointment of the former Prince Andrew to this role back in 2001. We've seen the reporting that the King, then Prince of Wales, expressed his concerns about that appointment. More alarmingly, we have read that Peter Mandelson wrote to the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, as his former Trade Secretary, pushing for Andrew's appointment. One friend of Epstein lobbying for a job for another friend of Epstein, a job that might help Epstein enrich himself. So we clearly need to get to the bottom of that appointment and the role Mandelson himself played in it. And only the papers demanded by this motion will allow us to do that. We need them published as soon as possible, without delay. And then there are the many questions about Andrew's conduct in the role, now subject to a criminal investigation. So clearly, Mr. Speaker, as you said, we do not want to jeopardise that investigation with anything we say today. We must let the police get on with their work, especially for Epstein's victims, survivors and their families. They deserve to see justice done at last. But I would just highlight one example of the way Jeffrey Epstein sought to use Andrew's role as trade envoy to enrich himself. Happy to give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. My right honourable friend talks about Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor's role as a trade envoy. When I was working overseas for the British Council, Mountbatten-Windsor came to an exhibition that I was putting on about Dolly the sheep, which was a fine example of British scientific innovation. Mountbatten-Windsor stood up in front of Japanese dignitaries and business people and said, "This is rubbish, this is Frankenstein's sheep." Would my right honourable friend agree with me that that's a very poor example of promoting British trade interests?
Well, I'm grateful for my honourable friend's intervention. It shows that not only some of the scandals that we've heard about are things that we need to focus on, but if the trade envoy was actually speaking against British commercial interests, that raises even greater questions. And I hope not just this debate, but other debates in select committees and elsewhere will get to the bottom of that issue. But I was saying I would like to highlight one example of how Jeffrey Epstein sought to use Andrew's role as trade envoy to enrich himself. Channel 4 uncovered emails in the Epstein files in which Epstein was trying to meet the Libyan dictator Gaddafi in the dying months of the Gaddafi regime to help him find somewhere to put his money. I think something that the minister actually raised at the time. In other words, Epstein looked at the deadly crisis in Libya and saw a chance to make some money. And he thought his friend Andrew could help. And this is what it says in one of the emails. "I wondered if PA could make the intro." A few weeks later, Andrew wrote back, "Libya fixed." Though the Epstein-Gaddafi meeting doesn't appear to have happened, it does show clearly what these relationships were all about for Epstein, increasing his own wealth and power. The idea that the role of special trade envoy for our United Kingdom may have been used to help him do that, to help a vile paedophile sex trafficker enrich himself, is truly sickening. And again, I want to pay tribute to the Minister who tried to raise this at the time, like his colleague, the late Paul Flynn. And it shows, again, why we need to change the rules of this House that govern the debate here and ministers. But Mr. I give way.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for giving way. I posed the question. Sorry, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. I stand corrected. The Leader of the... It's coming. I thank the Leader of the Liberal Democrats for giving way. I asked the question to the Chief Secretary yesterday in this House about the speed of bringing legislation forward. Victims, other members of the House, members of the Lords, we all need this process to be done as swiftly as possible. I just wonder if you agree that whatever happens with Andrew or anybody else, that you also agree that the Chief Secretary's comments that we do need to bring this forward and that we need to keep pushing to get legislation swiftly, not in years to come.
Well, I'm grateful for the Honourable Gentleman's intervention, both for his Freudian slip and indeed for his suggestion that we do need to speed up action in this area. But if I can begin to conclude, Mr. Speaker, in many ways this is the first truly global scandal, from the White House in Silicon Valley to Oslo and Paris. But it's also a deeply British scandal, reaching right to the top of the British establishment. Because can there be many people more symbolic of the rot that eats away at the British establishment than the former Duke of York and Special Trade Envoy, and the former Business Secretary, First Secretary of State, and Ambassador to the United States? Their association with Epstein and their actions on his behalf, while trusted with the privilege of public office, are a stain on our country. Today we must begin to clean away that stain with the disinfectant of transparency. Because whether it is the President of the United States and his Commerce Secretary, or Peter Mandelson and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, or Epstein himself, their victims and survivors have seen those responsible evade accountability and escape justice for far too long. I desperately hope, that is ending now, and I hope the House will approve this motion.
Yeah. The question is, as on the order paper, I call the Minister, Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear from the outset, we support this motion today. Frankly, it is the least we owe the victims of the horrific abuse that was perpetrated by Jeffrey Epstein and others. The abuse that was enabled, aided and abetted by a very extensive group of arrogant, entitled and often very wealthy individuals in this country and elsewhere. It's not just the people who participated in the abuse, it's the many, many more who turned a blind eye out of greed, familiarity or deference. To my mind, they too were complicit, just as complicit, and I welcome the reckoning that is coming to them now. I doubt there is anyone in this House who is not shocked and appalled by the recent allegations. Colleagues and many civil servants have told me their own stories of their interactions with Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, and they all betray the same pattern. A man on a constant self-aggrandising and self-enriching hustle. A rude, arrogant and entitled man who could not distinguish between the public interest, which he said he served, and his own private interest. I remember him coming to visit the Sea Cadets in Tonypandy. They were absolutely delighted and excited to meet a member of the royal family. But he insisted on coming by helicopter, unlike his mother, who came twice to the Ronda and always came by car. He left early and he showed next to no interest in the young people. That is, of course, Mr. Speaker, not a crime, nor is arrogance, fortunately, I suppose. Of course, we knew much of this, much of what is now in the public domain, actually a very long time ago. And I say very gently, it is all very well for some of us to say, if only we had known then what we know now, but I'm afraid that with me that doesn't wash. We did actually have plenty of warning. I called on the then Prime Minister David Cameron to dispense with the services of the then Duke of York in this chamber on the 28th of February 2011 because of his close friendship with Saif Gaddafi, as has just been referred to, and the convicted Libyan gun smuggler Tariq Kaitouni. I was rebuked by Speaker Bercow then for doing so because references to members of the royal family should be very rare, very sparing and very respectful. I didn't disagree with the ruling of Mr. Speaker, nor would I ever, as you know, Mr. Speaker, disagree with the ruling from the chair. I heard that. Over the next few days... I'm taking your advice, Mr. Speaker. I'm just ignoring that. Over the next few days, back in 2011, I repeatedly called for Andrew to be sacked in the public domain on television, on radio and in newspaper articles, citing his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, the mysteriously excessive £15 million cost paid for his Sunning Hill home and many other issues besides. I'm afraid the willful blindness of far too many at that time was absolutely spectacular, and it still angers me. The then Prime Minister, the then Home Secretary and many others in government defended Andrew time and time and time again. I was repeatedly told off, both in the chamber and outside the chamber. John Humphreys, the broadcaster, actually told me on the Today programme on the 7th of March, I think honourable members will be shocked by this, that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't quite a paedophile, drawing a distinction between sexual abuse of prepubescent and other children. Dominic Lawson, writing in the Sunday Times on the 11th of March, defended Andrew and made the same distinction between Epstein's involvement with teenage girls and paedophilia, since, as he put it, none of the girls was prepubescent, although he did at least admit that both were sordid and exploitative. I gently suggest that that is the least of what we have seen. So let me be absolutely clear. All of this happened after the photograph of Andrew with his arm around Virginia Giuffre was published in the Mail on Sunday on the 27th of February 2011. It is after the allegations, not before. Well, I'll give a word there and then to the end.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way, and I entirely agree with him in relation to the abhorrence of the comments that were in the media back then. But does he also agree with me that we still have a degree of that problem now, that often in the media we talk about underage girls, where actually what we're talking about is children? And does he agree with me that we should be ensuring that when we talk about Epstein's crimes, we talk about the children that were involved?
100%, and I think we should also be referring to statutory rape, because that is what it is. And statutory rape is no better than any other kind of rape. It is rape. End of story. Of course.
Grateful to the Minister for giving way, speaking very powerfully about this issue, and has a strong track record, one of the strongest track records in standing up on these types of issues. I have asked that the Government release the files concerning whatever his new name is, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, when he was a trade envoy. That request has been refused. Can I ask gently the Minister to review that decision, and to ask that all of these files, in the new spirit of openness and transparency, that those files are open for all to see?
Of course, I completely respect my honourable friend, and he's made this point several times, not only in the chamber but also to me privately. And I agree with him. That is the direction of travel that we're going in, and that's why we agree with the humble address today as it's been presented. We're not standing in the way. We will do everything we can to comply with that as fast as we possibly can. I will come on to a couple of caveats a little bit later, but I just want to pursue the point about what we knew in the past, because the leader of the Liberal Democrats quite rightly said that on the 7th that Paul Flynn had a debate on the 4th of May, to which he responded as not actually as the Minister responsible, but standing in for the Minister responsible. But actually Paul Flynn also had another debate on the 17th of March in Westminster Hall, which was granted to him by the Backbench Business Committee, which had relatively recently then been set up. And he concluded, because he was finding it very difficult to make any of the allegations that he wanted to make because of the rules of the House, that there really is no point in continuing with the debate. That is a direct quote from him. And in fact, the then Deputy Leader of the House, David Heath, who was another Liberal Democrat member of the government at the time, made the point that, as I think Mr. Speaker has been made both by Mr. Burko and by yourself, that if there is a substantive motion, of course we can make these comments in relation to certain members, but it has to be a substantive motion, and you have to find a means of being able to table that motion, as indeed we have a substantive motion today. And then, following that, Paul Flynn tried to get a substantive motion, which was then the debate, but it was actually an adjournment debate on the 4th of May, which is therefore not a substantive motion again, and he struggled again, and this is what he said in that debate. The Speaker would quite rightly abide by the rules of the House and tell me I was not allowed to make any derogatory statements that might affect the envoy, his personality or his name. It is an illustration of how demeaned we are as politicians and members of Parliament that I am allowed to make any points about the damage that is done only in an oblique way by discussing the effects of the holder of the office, his role and the comments that are being made. And of course he felt furious, angry. He wrote a great book about being an MP, which I commend to all honourable members. And the Right Honourable Member, as he knows, he responded to that debate as follows. I, for one, believe that the Duke of York does an excellent job as the UK's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment. He promotes UK business interests around the world and helps to attract inward investment. He went on at some length and then added at the end, he has made a valuable contribution in developing significant opportunities for British business through the role and continues to do so. I just say gently to him, I think if he'd followed the debates in the public domain at the time, he would have known better than to have made those comments. I won't go any further, but I'm happy to give way if he wants.
Well, the Minister knows that I apologise for that comment. Taking the brief from someone else, I really wish I hadn't said those words because I'm thinking about the victims. And I praised him for the role he took. I hope he will acknowledge that 2 months after that debate, Andrew left that role, and that was right that he did. And the government, I wasn't privy to those discussions, but the government did get rid of him.
Yes, he left his post in July, I think, of 2011. It could have come soon enough for many of us, and it is a regret, I think, to many that the government wasn't able to listen faster and to act faster at that time. Mr. Speaker, what I believe this whole saga shows is that deference can be a toxic presence in the body politic. Of course, we always seek to respect others. We look for the best in others. There was another instance in that first debate that shows the generosity we often show, and I have told the Honourable Member that I'm going to raise this. The Right Honourable Member for New Forest East, who is a gentleman to his fingertips and is always a very magnanimous fellow, said, does the Minister agree that one reason why the Duke of York has considerable credibility is his distinguished record as a former member of the Fleet Air Arm who gave valuable service in the Falklands War? That shows a degree of commitment over and above any inherited responsibilities that he might be considered to have. Of course, I understand the point that the Right Honourable Member was making back then in 2011. But of course, the fear is that when deference tips over into subservience, it can be terribly dangerous because the victims don't get heard, respected or understood in the same way as those with grand titles do. And this, of course, has implications for this House, as the Right Honourable Member said. Mr. Speaker, of course, the conduct of business in this House is entirely a matter for you and interpreting with the clerks the Erskine May and the standing orders. I only repeat the words of Paul Flynn in 2011, who denounced what he called censorship on honourable members discussing an issue of great importance. I know you too would want to denounce such censorship. I want to issue one caveat about the motion today. The government will, of course, comply with the terms of the humble address in full. As I say, we support the motion. But as the House will know, there is a live police investigation into the former Duke of York after his arrest on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The House will also be aware that following that arrest on the 19th of February, Buckingham Palace issued a statement on behalf of the King. His Majesty emphasised that the law must take its course and that the Palace will provide its full and wholehearted support and cooperation. The statement concluded with a commitment that His Majesty and the royal family would continue in their duty and service to the nation. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that is a sentiment that the whole House will support. As the police have rightly said, it is absolutely crucial that the integrity of their investigation is protected. And now these proceedings are underway, it would be wrong of me to say anything that might prejudice them. Nor will the government be able to put into the public domain anything that is required by the police for them to conduct their inquiries unless and until the police are satisfied. I'm sure the Honourable Member would agree with that point. Yes, of course.
I agree with everything he's saying, but I think what's worrying quite a lot of us, and not just concerning Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but Manderson as well, is that because are these ongoing police investigations, and because the wheels of justice grind exceedingly slow, it might be years before we see any of these papers. And I just really want to have an assurance from the government that they will do their utmost, despite what he just said about the police investigation, to ensure there's full transparency, because actually scandals are made much, much worse by any sense of cover-up.
I couldn't agree more with the honourable gentleman. I want to make sure that we move as fast as we possibly can, but I also want to make sure that justice does happen, and I don't want to do anything that would undermine the police investigations. I hope that they will be able to move as swiftly as possible, and we will certainly cooperate with them as swiftly as possible. I should just say it's worth bearing in mind that the documents that might be envisaged in this are mostly 25 years old, some of them a bit earlier. They may be substantial in number, and many of them will be in hard copy. So I hate to add to the right honourable member's fears about the speed with which things may be able to happen. But I think we would all want to make sure that we do all of this in a proper fashion. All of that, yes, of course.
Giving way, and as a point of clarification regarding the police investigations, he might have seen the intervention that Gordon Brown made on Sunday, asking constabularies to consider widening the probe on the basis of files that had been released as part of the data dump. One of the questions that's arisen, and I appreciate he won't be able to comment on what those police forces are planning to do or not do, but that all government departments, including the Ministry of Defence and including the Department for Transport, would be fully cooperative with anything that they would need. Could he give the assurance that every single department, without fear or favour, will give them whatever they need if they wish to widen the investigation?
We will do two things. First of all, we will seek to comply with the humble address as soon as we possibly can, given the caveat that I've already issued about the police investigation. We will also make sure that every single part of government cooperates entirely with both the Thames Valley Police and any other investigations by any other police forces, police force that there may be, on whatever they may be investigating. It's not for me as a government minister to instruct the police what they should or shouldn't investigate, or point them in one direction or another. Former Prime Ministers have a different set of responsibilities, so she's quite right. I don't want to undermine the investigation, but I also don't want to delay it in any way, and we will make sure that every department... yes, I don't want to give way to every single member of the Liberal Democrats, but I will, of course.
I thank the Minister greatly. Would he agree with me that it's actually timely, right now, that the government presses ahead with the Public Office Accountability Bill, which allows the Amendment 23, which is blocking everything at the moment, seems to be a way through and to ensure that we have transparency and that there's openness, but there is the security that the government can be assured, as can other members of the House, that anything that is subject to matters of intelligence or security, and indeed matters related to the police investigation, will not be released. There seems to be there's an answer in the government's hands, and I know not why they are waiting and waiting and waiting to get this sorted.
I'm not sure. She might have to repeat to me what she thinks the answer that is thus far evading me might be.
If I may, I will just say that actually this all relates. I could talk to him also about the whistleblowing bill and the office for an independent office for a whistleblower. It is the matter that people should be able to reveal what they know. They should tell the truth. I think it's shocking that we have to have legislation that people are told to tell the truth, but actually all of this falls into the same remit, in that people should be free to declare exactly what it is they know, that papers should be released, but you have an independent judge, which is what happens at the moment and is what is in this number 23 amendment. An independent judge, High Court judge, says what may and may not be released.
Can I just suggest we shorten interventions rather than making speeches, Minister?
I think I just want to return, Mr. Speaker, to what I said earlier, which the government will be... We will put everything into the public domain when we can. I don't want to do so at a time which would make it impossible for the police to secure the proper processes that they need to be able to do. I'm not sure that adding an intervening person helps that process, but I'm happy to listen if she catches your eye later on in the debate. And Mr. Speaker, with the leave of the House, I'll be responding to the debate as well. So I'm very happy to answer lots of questions. All right.
So specifically on this point, I'm grateful that the Minister is very willing to say that he will comply with the terms of this motion, but is also trying to manage expectations about the speed in which the government may act. He will know that there will nonetheless still be some members of the public who will view that with some suspicion and alarm. They will be worried that the government might be trying to long grass it or put it in the too hard basket. Could the Minister commit either now or by the end of the debate that the government will regularly update this House so that opposition parties don't have to repeatedly bring ministers to the House through urgent questions? Could he agree perhaps to set out by the end of this debate how often the government would intend to inform this House about regular updates?
I'm very happy to commit now to updating the House as often as I possibly can in a way that is informative to the House. But she's quite right that I am slightly trying to manage people's expectations about timeliness, partly because of the quantity of material and because there is a live police investigation, and I just don't want to jeopardise that. If there are things that, I will in a moment, if there are things that are embarrassing to the government, that's who cares? I want to make sure that we end up getting the proper justice that is necessary for the victims, and that means that we have to have a proper police procedure. If there are charges brought, then that has to go through a judicial process as well, and I don't want to undermine that. But of course, I'm very happy both in a private way and publicly to update the House when I have anything possible to say. Now, I am trying to get to the end of my speech, and people normally like it when I get to the end of my speech. So I see I've united the House, Mr. Speaker. But I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I understand the concern about not treading upon the police investigation, but surely the police investigation is about the conduct of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor in the role, whereas this humble address is about the appointment and the process of appointment. Is there not a distinction there which means that this humble address of itself should not unduly impede any police investigation or be hindered by it?
Well, if he doesn't mind, I'm quite happy to explain to him out of the chamber precisely why I disagree with him, because I don't, again, if I were to explain more fully in the chamber, I think that might not be very helpful to either the police or the criminal process. But I'm very happy to explain to him outside the chamber, and I think he might come back in and agree with me. I think he might. Just sometimes he agrees with me. He agrees. Not very often, but anyway. You know, small mercies and all, eh? Mr. Speaker, I also want to make it absolutely clear to the House that the former Duke of York's role as a special trade representative was very different to the one performed by the government's current trade envoys. This has often been confused, I think, in the public discussion at the moment. Trade envoys today are appointed by ministers with a formalised set of rules of conduct. They are unpaid. They work with my department on attracting and retaining inward investment while supporting UK firms to take full advantage of new trade opportunities. They are all members of either this House or another House. And I have recently emphasised to all of those trade envoys the importance of maximising the programme's impact on ensuring that it aligns completely with the goals of our trade and industrial strategies. They are under the same obligations as ministers in adhering to departmental restrictions, guidelines and confidentiality clauses, the same ones outlined in the Ministerial Code. In sum, trade envoys play an important role in boosting economic growth, delivering our industrial and trade strategies and helping British business to export. I'll stress this again, Mr. Speaker. The role held by Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was not a trade envoy position as we would understand it today, and I'm enormously grateful to the trade envoys today who go beyond the call of duty in promoting UK PLC. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's role was a separate one entitled UK Special Representative for International Trade and Investment. Mr. Speaker, there is unanimous agreement across this House that those who may be guilty of misconduct in public office should face the full force of the law. That applies to everyone, regardless of who they are or how they were appointed. This was a point made by my right honourable friend prior to the news of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's arrest. One of the core principles of our constitutional system is the rule of law. That means that everyone is equal under the law and nobody is above the law. I share the anger, the disgust expressed by many at the alleged behaviour of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. What we are seeing now is a full, fair and proper process by which this issue is investigated by the police. And in that investigation, they will, of course, have the government's unwavering cooperation and support. Sometimes it feels to many members of our country that there is one rule for the rich and famous and another rule for the rest of us. But actually, there is only one rule, the rule of law.
To Shadow Secretary of State Alex Burkhardt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman for securing this debate. I should say at the outset the Conservatives support this motion. And the truth is that the people who helped Jeffrey Epstein, who helped him by supplying him with contacts and information, were the people who enabled him to become powerful. And those people effectively enabled him to build his net of influence, his net of abuse. And that network of power, in turn, enabled him to abuse more and more people. So it is quite right that this House is enabled to scrutinise what went on and how it went on. I listened to the Minister's remarks and I appreciate the way that, that he's approached this debate and the way that the government is going to constructively cooperate with the terms of the address. But I must say that this is the second occasion in only a few weeks when the government has had to be brought here by opposition parties under the terms of a humble address to disclose information that it could quite obviously have disclosed without the need for a humble address in the first place. And so whilst I accept the humility with which he's taken the debate, actually the government as a whole could have been much more proactive on this issue right from the start. And I also appreciate the humble way in which he came to the House and reminded us that he had been right all along. Very humble. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, referred to this as the first global political scandal. And indeed, it is a global political scandal that has reached its tendrils into the operation of many governments across the West and indeed the East. And the fact that our allies in Poland have launched an intelligence investigation into Epstein's links with Russia, the fact that in the published Epstein papers it's clear that Jeffrey Epstein was supplying people at the very top end of Putin's regime with sensitive information about the American leadership shows that this is an international scandal and one in which our government and our security services must play their part in uncovering things. I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman is a lover of history, so I must gently take issue with his claims that this is the first global political scandal. I think the Dreyfus affair, the XYZ scandal, the Panama scandal, there have been many, but this is, to take a substantive point, a global political scandal. And I'd very much like to associate myself with the remarks made by my honourable friend from Strangford, that we can only be, as a general point, very supportive of the royal family's role in promoting our country. I think those people who have witnessed the best of the royal family using its awesome soft power to support what we do best can only be in awe of the vast commitment it makes to public service and to the life of the country. And indeed, if it is the case, as reported in the press, that very senior members of the royal family expressed concerns about Mr. Mountbatten Windsor's appointment in 2001, one can only feel enormous sympathy with them about what has subsequently come to light. Because these revelations surrounding the relationship between Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and Jeffrey Epstein, just as with the relationship between Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein, and the arrest of both men on suspicion of misconduct in public office, make it right that questions are asked and make it right that information is brought before this House. And if one looks back to 2001, it is possible to identify the hand of Epstein in Mr. Mountbatten Windsor's appointment. It is reported that Peter Mandelson first met Epstein in the summer of 2001. Mountbatten Windsor had first met Epstein, I believe, in 1999. And shortly after Mandelson's first meeting in October 2001, Mandelson is appointed as trade envoy. The minister shakes his head. I'll go through the chronology again for him because it's there's no harm. Mandelson met Epstein. Hansard will report. It may be that the numbers were juggled up in the minister's head. That in the summer of 2001, Mandelson met Epstein for the first time, and in October 2001, Mountbatten Windsor was appointed as trade envoy. And so it's possible that Mandelson influenced. Now, what I also said is that in 1999, Mountbatten Windsor met Epstein for the first time, so he was already an associate of Epstein. So I'm glad to have that sorted out. I can go through it again, but I'm sure the Minister can read about it tomorrow. I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
Very grateful to the Shadow Minister for giving way. I think by sketching out that timeline, I think that brings to light the reason why in our humble address we are calling for information in relation to the actual creation of the appointment, which the Minister rightly pointed out was a unique role that was created for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Does he therefore agree with me that we are right to not only call out that creation of the role, but also to ascertain whether Mandelson had any role within it?
No, very much so. And as I say, what would have been better is if the government had been proactive on this and had not had to be brought to the House by opposition parties in order to release this information. And I'm very glad that the Liberal Democrats have learnt the lesson of the Conservatives' humble address a few weeks ago, that it's always good that once the Conservatives have, designed a bandwagon, got it up and running, showed that it can move at high speed, the Liberal Democrats scramble up and get on board. But, better late than never. And so, is anybody trying? No, fine. And so as we see, if we go through the sequencing very carefully, it's possible that there was influence from Epstein, who we must acknowledge was not had not been arrested or convicted in 2001, but about whom there were rumours and reports, and who in any case was a highly influential foreign businessman. And if it was under his influence that Mr Mountbatten Windsor was appointed as trade envoy, then it would be useful to see what the Prime Minister knew when that appointment was made. I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
Giving way. I think what he's trying to get to is a point that deeply concerns me, which is we need to understand the extent to which the then Prince Andrew was leaning on government for things that he wanted. And an example of this is in the recent Epstein files. There is an exchange between Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein, about how Andrew had written to the Ministry of Defence in order to allow their plane to land at an RAF base in Norfolk on the 7th of December in 2000. So his influence on government predated his appointment. And what we want to understand is to what extent was he already trying to influence government as a prince, and what did that lead to in his role as a trade envoy? Would he agree that that is incredibly important to get to the bottom of?
Yes, and I'm afraid I don't know what year 2000. Well, I agree with her, that's an interesting point, although I think if one looks at the precise wording of the Liberal Democrat humble address, something like that might not fall within its context. So, she may wish to table an amendment to her own party's humble address in order to get at that. But look, transparency is essential in all of this. And that's, why, on this side of the House, we very much hope that the government will give us transparency quickly. And I turn to the point that my right honourable friend, Father of the House, made, that there is a danger that the government uses a police process as a means of not disclosing certain information. And I say that not because of what the Minister has said today, so much as what was said yesterday by the right honourable gentleman who is the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, when in context of our own humble address, he said, "I can confirm that those documents will be made available, subject, I am afraid, to the exclusion of one particular item, in which number 10, asked Peter Mandelson a number of questions. The Met Police have asked that to be held back, subject to their investigations. That item will therefore have to be published at a later date, but the documents that are not subject to the Met Police investigation will be published very shortly. I think it would assist this House if, I think this was a point that my honourable friend from North Antrim made, it would assist this House if the government could explain why the Met Police have asked that that item is held back. And I also think it would be helpful if the government would confirm that there is no bar to it handing that document over to the ISC. And this is a point on which the Chair has been very clear. On the 4th of February, Mr. Speaker said, the Metropolitan Police have no jurisdiction over this House, have no jurisdiction over what this House may wish to do. It will be a matter of whether or not the government provide the information. I want to let members know that the police cannot dictate to this House. That the police cannot dictate to this House. And there is a means that was specifically debated during the original humble address, which enabled members of this House, i.e. the ISC, to be given this information regardless of police investigation. Happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way in what is a very important point that he is making, and something which concerns me deeply in this is that my constituents, members of the public, are increasingly concerned that what they see is the tendrils that the honourable gentleman referred to reaching into government through this debate, and that in the handling of these papers and the release of information, we must at all times be aware of the impact on the reputation, not just on Andrew Mountbatten Windsor or Lord Mandelson, but on us in this place, previous governments and subsequent governments in Parliament. Would the honourable member agree?
Very much so. And I know that I know that honourable members, or certain honourable members on all sides, will be aware of just how bad it will look if the government does not provide information swiftly as possible. I'll give an example where that is not happening, given that the original humble address was nearly 2 weeks ago. Now, during that debate, I raised the issue of Palantir and how in February last year the Prime Minister had an unrecorded meeting with Palantir in Washington, didn't appear in his register of meetings. He was accompanied on that visit by Peter Mandelson. Peter Mandelson, whose company in which he held a commanding share, had Palantir as a client, and then subsequently, later in the year, Palantir received a direct award from government worth about £240 million. A very substantial contract. When I raised this in the House, there was concern on both sides, it was a cross-party issue, and the Minister agreed to write to me confirming, or I asked him to confirm, that the Cabinet Secretary, whoever that turned out to be, would be investigating what is clearly looks like a case of conflict of interest. I still have not received a reply. I've not received any reply, despite me bringing it up again at the dispatch box at the start of this week and being assured that I would receive a response. I just don't think that this is good enough. And it's very, very important that the opposition can hold the government to account in a meaningful way. So to the Honourable Lady's point, I think it's extremely important that the government should be seen to be willingly providing information rather than having to be pushed every step of the way to do the right thing. And I'll just sort of make an additional point on this score. And whilst we do very much support the humble address today, I just ask the government to be clear that nothing in this humble address is going to slow down the process of delivering on the original humble address. Nothing at all. Because whilst there is historic interest and contemporary interest in the history of what happened in 2001, what this government did in choosing to appoint Peter Mandelson, despite the information that it had at its disposal, is of paramount importance. This government must come clean, and come clean quickly, because, as Buckingham Palace said the other day, no one is above the law.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Unaccountable power must not hide. Privilege must not be protected. Money must be accounted for, and elite networks of men operating here and overseas must meet their reckoning for dehumanising, subjugating, exploiting and sexually assaulting women who must have justice. The web of abuse surrounding Mr. Epstein and his associates must be brought to book. And Mr. Mountbatten-Windsor, as a known associate, must also be held to account in his role as a special trade envoy and for his associations too. We have all been revulsed by the stories that we have heard, and that's why today's debate must also be about the victims and survivors. I first raise concern, obviously, because my constituency carries the name York, and the Duke of York's ambassadorial associations with our city cause much concern in my community. And therefore I brought those concerns to the House on the 21st of February 2022. And this was just days after the settlement to the lawsuit to Ms Giuffre, known to be in the region of £12 million. Clearly my city was very disturbed, and as a result of that, a human rights city no less, I sought to see a separation between the title and the city, and brought forward later that year, after working very closely with the clerks, a bill in order to remove the title, something which still has not been done. I brought forward another bill just last year for the removal of title, again bringing in the option of removing the title from peerages as well, and having worked through that, still not had a positive response to that. But the reason I'm speaking in this debate today is because in looking into these issues, I realise that the humble address itself is narrow in its scope. But secondly, what do we do with the information once it's been corroborated? Clearly, there's the police investigation, which must take its course, and I'm sure will be deep and thorough because it runs so far. But ultimately, if we're just looking at the appointment, what about the period over that time where he carried out the role, and also the implications to the wider networks? So I don't want this to end up in the court of public opinion, or perhaps the media digging deeper and deeper into more and more stories. But what does it do to this place? What does it do to change the way that systems work? I'm happy to give way.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I recognise definitely the work she's done on titles and holding Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor to account. I think she's raising a good point around making sure we don't have a court of public opinion, but I would like to give my thanks to many of the media outlets, it doesn't matter which one you read, what your political slant is, who have done tremendous work trawling through tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents, and I do think we owe them a debt of gratitude for bringing to light many of the awful things that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor is alleged to have been associated with. Does she agree with me on that point?
Yeah. I do agree with the honourable gentleman, because I know that journalists have been up through the night poring over the Epstein files, digging deep to hold power to account, and it's a vital role that our media does, and long may it continue. Their scrutiny is important for this place and the work that we do here. But in saying that, we need a process of learning from this. And I do believe there should be a judge-led inquiry to ensure that the multiple strands of this global network of power are brought into account, so we can learn and we can hold to account in this place any future concerns that we may have around how these associations are formed, the depth in which they infiltrate places like this, or indeed the government, and indeed international networks, which as we have learnt over the last few weeks, where sensitive information has been shared, financial information has been shared, issues which impact on our constituents as markets, trade, and that has an impact on the very people we're here to represent. And I think for no longer can these powerful men swan around the world, having these conversations, gaining more power and exploiting whoever passes their path and not be accountable. And therefore we need to understand how to bring transparency across all institutions, including all areas of government, even deeper, as we try to do in this place each and every day. As the Honourable Member for Oxford West and Abingdon says, it's far-reaching, this inquiry that must pursue. I recognise that many departments are missed out in the humble address. To understand, for instance, how transport has been used. We need to understand not just civil transport, but military transport, the missing logs, who were on those planes, where were they going to, and where did they come from? We need to understand the expenses system that ensued, how signing off for massages became a duty of the taxpayer. Clearly, individuals questioned it, as we heard, but the reality is people weren't feeling empowered to blow the whistle and to raise those concerns. So we need to ensure that we institute processes where people can raise concern wherever they see that. We don't have the confidence at the moment within the systems that that was undertaken. So how are we going to institute that? Then there's questions about visas. We know that 90 people came in and out of the country during the period that we are looking at today. And of course, rigour in appointment processes. Much has been heard over the last few months around that, and of course that comes to the heart of the humble address today. But we need to ensure that all those appointments are transparent. And whilst I heard what the Minister said today, we have 32 trade envoys. I've never seen one post advertised. I'm not aware of the expertise that those individuals have with regards to trade or their particular relations with a particular country, and what they actually add, what value they actually bring, how we assess that from this place. And therefore I do ask that we have a proper review over all of these appointments that we hear about as to what they bring, because surely we should have better accountability. And finally, I just want to raise the intelligence services as well. I cannot believe that our intelligence services were not aware of some of the movements that Mr Mountbatten Windsor had. How do we bring that to account too, to ensure that that information is also in the public domain? And where are the minutes of all of those meetings? What do they say? And how do we find out? So there are so many questions in response to the humble address being put today, but I do think we have to think about what we want to do from this point on as well, not just holding that information, not just examining that information, not just commenting in the tea rooms and the corridors. What we want to do is to ensure that that power is held to account, and that those with privilege know that they are answerable for the responsibilities that they hold. So I conclude. As the light is shone deeper into the darkest of these networks, of the elite exploitations, and the systems must be overhauled and reviewed. May the police do their job and do it well and extensively. And in this place, may we focus always on the women who were exploited, gaslit and traumatised and left broken, as we seek justice, but also seek to hold that power to account.
Monica Harding.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to speak today about transparency and accountability in public life, and how the system that we find ourselves in today has been maintained and got us to where we are. In the early noughties, I was working overseas, as I've said, with the British Council. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor visited us as part of his role as a UK trade envoy. Before his arrival, senior staff in both the Embassy and the British Council were rolling their eyes. His reputation preceded him. I was told it was a containment exercise, that overseas missions feared putting him out there in case he said something inappropriate, that he was arrogant and that he wasn't on top of the detail of his brief. Rather than looking forward to his visits as an opportunity to promote Britain, instead it was thought that he would do damage. Moreover, there were rumours about him that he refused to stay in the ambassador's residence, would only stay in the Four Seasons or similar top-end hotels, and that he took with him an ironing board overseas when he went. That was a euphemism for a massage table. That was all well known amongst many officials. It even inspired a BBC TV programme, The Ambassadors, in 2013, a couple of years after Andrew was forced to relinquish his role as trade envoy. But this, it seems, was known about in the diplomatic circles I experienced way back at the start of the noughties, and yet Andrew Mountbatten Windsor enjoyed another 10 years as a trade envoy. But yet when I questioned why this was allowed to happen, I was met with a shrug. Everyone knows, it was said. Andrew, as I have said, came to an exhibition I had put on about Dolly the sheep, at the time the pinnacle of British innovation, and we were rightly proud of it as an example of UK scientific excellence. And one of my team, a young Japanese woman who worked for the British government as a member of staff of the British Council, her job, we paid her, was to promote the UK, showed the then prince around with some Japanese dignitaries. Dolly the sheep, he sneered, it's rubbish. Frankenstein sheep, he said. My team member was deflated and didn't understand why this representative of the British state diminished what she was rightly proud of. And the talk of Andrew and what he was like came to my own personal dinner table. My late father-in-law, Air Vice Marshal in the RAF, was at a dinner overseas with Mountbatten Windsor on an overseas trip in the 1990s. Windsor said in front of many foreign military and diplomatic seniors, no need for a Royal Air Force. My father-in-law said nothing, and that was a problem. You couldn't because of Windsor's privileged position, but he raised it with the Chief of Air Staff and was told it would be raised with the palace. What happened next? Who knows? Did diplomats raise the concern to their seniors and to the very top from early on? Did the palace do its own internal investigation? If they did, was it shared with the Department for Business and Trade? Where did these concerns all go? And in doing so, did they, the system, unwittingly or wittingly, support protection or cover-up? Because of the way things were done or deference? That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the point of this debate. Some officials knew, or the system seemed to know, but the system seemingly failed to do anything about it for 10 years because of privilege and because of deference.
Will she give way?
I will give way.
Thank you for giving way. I mean, just on this point around which departments had which papers, does she not also think, and I note in the humble address today, it says departments including but not limited to. Surely the royal household, papers in the royal household that relate to this matter should also come under the scope of this humble address. Does she agree?
Thank you, honourable friend. I do agree. I think here there is a systematic failure and joined-upness that we need to unravel. And I will come back to that in the course of this speech. When there was scrutiny after 2011, there was still a failure of oversight. What does this say about our society, how we protect privilege, and what we are prepared to accept on behalf of the British state and our representatives? Can rules be broken by some people and not others? Do propriety and ethics belong to all those who represent the British state? Madam Deputy Speaker, we have a parliamentary monarchy. That means that if the palace does not open itself to scrutiny and carry out its own inquiry, then Parliament must. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I have some questions. On what basis was Andrew Mountbatten Windsor given the role as trade envoy? Who put him forward, and was there resistance to it? While he was trade envoy, what concerns were raised and with whom, from what date, and how were they actioned? Money was put up by the royal family to protect him. Does Parliament have a right to understand why that money was put up and that public funds were not used in the civil settlement with Virginia Giuffre? Can we, as Parliament, find this out, that not one penny of public money was used in this settlement? Madam Deputy Speaker, I know you will share with me the concern about levels of public confidence in our institutions, all our institutions, and in the people that represent them. Parliament must assert itself in this regard, and I call, along with my colleagues, for the full publication of all documents related to Mountbatten Windsor's appointment as a special envoy and an end to negative privilege, so that MPs in this place can speak freely about the concerns they have and disclose information in the House of Commons, even if that individual is a member of the royal family. I will end, as I must, with thoughts of the victims of the Epstein scandal, which has triggered so much of this debate, and all of those who are victims of power and privilege and deference. They are foremost in our minds as this for all continues. It is thanks to their bravery that we know the extent of Epstein's crimes and the wider implications for our own establishment. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to her for giving way, and I'm very conscious she said she was close to concluding, but her words at the end there for victims are very, very powerful. I co-chair the Harrods Survivors of Al Fayed, APPG, and we've just started our work, but members may have heard a very powerful interview on The World at One a couple of weeks ago, which talked about the fact that that lack of acknowledgement of what had taken place, and also that the police were not properly understanding trafficking. The Shadow Minister described this as a global enterprise. Does she agree with me that we need to do much, much more work around this? And it isn't just about the victims of Epstein, it is about other trafficking victims.
I thank my honourable friend, and she is quite right. This is about systemic failure, and we are at the very, very beginning of this. This is not the end, this is the beginning. And for the victims of Epstein, we must do everything we can to ensure this investigation and inquiry continues into it. On behalf of those victims, that are suffering right now from the same thing, we must ensure that the wider system cleans itself up, and we must facilitate that.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The release of the Epstein files has shone a light where so many people did not want a light to be shone. Because even with millions of documents still to be released, what's abundantly clear is that for decades, the rich, the politically powerful and the well-connected have colluded to cover up their utterly appalling behaviours. And that light which is now being shone doesn't just illuminate those who are personally responsible for their behaviour. It also reveals those who knew what was happening, who enabled it, and who chose to turn a blind eye to it. And the people of this country are rightly furious. And that's why at the humble address yesterday on the release of the Peter Mandelson files, I made this point, and I'll make it again today, that with trust in the government at an all-time low, they really only have one chance to come clean about everything that they know and about everything that they hold, pertaining in this case to the creation of the role of Special Representative for Trade and Investment and the appointment of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor to that post. Of course, unlike the Mandelson files which this House demanded be released, the appointment of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor didn't happen on the current government's watch. But Mr Mandelson leaves a long trail, and there may well be information which relates directly to him and which will cause serious embarrassment to many senior Labour Party figures who were in power at the time. Because let's not forget, the author Andrew Loney in his book entitled details, in into great detail, about how it was the former Trade Secretary Peter Mandelson who assisted Mr Mountbatten Windsor in landing the role of UK's Special Representative, seemingly against the advice of Mr Mountbatten's brother, the then Prince Charles. So let me repeat my warning from yesterday that these files must be released, and they must be released in full, because any attempt to sanitise what is in them and to save face for any government ministers, past or present, could have serious long-term consequences for our democracy. But it is also, Madam Deputy Speaker, the very least the victims and the survivors deserve. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know there are serious questions that need answered about the appointment of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor as Trade Envoy back in 2001. Those questions include: whose idea was this? Who vetted him?
Was he vetted at all? What role did Peter Mandelson play in making this appointment happen? What in his previous life made him uniquely suitable for the position of UK Trade Envoy? What warnings were given before and during his stint as Trade Envoy about his character and his behaviour? Who was he responsible to while serving as Trade Envoy? Who scrutinised his behaviour and his spending? And what warnings were given during his time as Trade Envoy, and how were those warnings handled? Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to say, in a normal functioning democracy, we wouldn't have to have waited until Andrew Mountbatten had been stripped of his titles, evicted from his royal house, and was facing removal from the line of succession before being able to discuss this issue. There have been serious concerns about Mr Mountbatten Windsor for decades, much of it relating to his time as Trade Envoy. There are reports of him requesting that the public purse cover the cost of his massage services. And when one understandably angry and unhappy civil servant complained, he was promptly overruled by his bosses. That now retired civil service commented recently, "I can't say it would have stopped him, but we should have flagged that something was wrong." And of course something was wrong. But what difference would it have made to us in this House? Because as a member of the royal family at that time, we were not allowed to question or examine what Mr Mountbatten was doing as our special trade envoy. But it wasn't just civil servants who found getting information on Mr Mountbatten Windsor all but impossible. The author Andrew Loney again has reported that he's had multiple freedom of information requests rejected, including on the grounds that it would be too time-consuming for the government departments to go through the volume of information, with one rejection actually saying that looking at just 1 year of Mr Mountbatten's time as Trade Envoy would mean going through 1,927 digital files, each containing multiple pieces of information. Yet until now, and until Mr Mountbatten's status changed, we in this House were not allowed to discuss it. Yes, absolutely.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. And he's speaking, I think, to the fact that the title Prince has protected Andrew Mountbatten Windsor from greater scrutiny and inspection of his activities. What does he think we should do around ensuring that other titles, whether they be Royal or Prime Minister or Secretary of State, don't protect powerful individuals?
I thank the honourable member for that intervention. And the answer is quite simple, Madam Deputy Speaker. Nobody can be above the law. Everybody has to be equal in the eyes of the law. And as Paul Flynn, the great Paul Flynn, said, we have to remove the bandages from our mouths in this place. And it's a point I will return to. But fundamentally, nobody, regardless of rank or privilege, should be or must be allowed to be above the law. And I know that many people will be embarrassed by what has happened, you know, not least, as we've heard, the now leader of the Liberal Democrats, who is Under Secretary for Business, Innovation and Skills, and I presume with his fingers firmly crossed behind his back, was forced to come out and stoutly defend the then Prince Andrew, saying, I believe the Prince of York is doing an excellent job. He's a long-standing success and he's been great for British business. But the reality is, as a government minister, what else could he have said? Because we are not allowed to speak the truth in this place when it comes to certain individuals. And within 3 months of the Right Honourable Member making those comments, Mr Mountbatten Windsor had resigned from the job in disgrace because of his continued relationship with the convicted paedophile and child sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. But it wasn't just his relationship with Epstein that caused the concern. In February of 2011, the Minister at the dispatch box today, the Right Honourable Member for Rhondda and Ogmore, attempted to raise a question about the special representative role and his links to the notorious convicted Libyan arms smuggler, only to be told from the then Speaker, references to the royal family should be very rare, very sparing and very respectful. Madam Deputy Speaker, these archaic rules make a mockery of our democracy. And the situation we face now was always going to occur, particularly when the royal family can and do have both a constitutional role and involve themselves in the political realm. Absolutely.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would the honourable member agree with me that it's quite extraordinary that we're urging the Parliament of a foreign country, Congress, to investigate this matter when this is our trade envoy and a member of the royal family?
There is a slight, I thank the honourable member for that intervention. There's a slight irony, that we are talking, we like to talk ourselves as being the mother of Parliament, the cradle of democracy. And yet, when it comes to an issue such as this, we are bound by archaic rules, which means we cannot hold the most powerful people to account. And let's be honest, when it comes to the royal family, there may be some very, very good ones, there may be some very, very bad ones. But if you believe in a hereditary monarchy, it's your pot luck what you get. Madam Deputy Speaker, having seen the rules that have led us to where we are now, it is surely time to review them, because it is beyond ridiculous that someone in a similar position could be appointed to exactly the same job as Mr Mountbatten Windsor was, but because they have been lucky in the great genealogical sweepstake, they find themselves born into the royal family and therefore automatically above scrutiny, accountability, and therefore above beyond reproach. Absolutely.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. I'm listening very closely to what he's saying. But given that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is no longer a royal, there's not really anything stopping us having a judge-led public inquiry into his affairs and all that attends thereupon. Does he agree?
I could not agree more with my honourable friend. Absolutely. But isn't it ridiculous? Isn't it ridiculous that the King had to strip him of his titles, evict him from his home, for us to be able to have this discussion? And I think that is what has to change. So in conclusion, I urge the Minister, for that great trailblazer, Paul Flynn, the former member for Newport East, I hope that the government not only release everything that they hold pertaining to the appointment of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but they also remove what he described as the bandages on our mouths, so that no one is above the law and no one's behaviour is beyond scrutiny by members of this House.
Anna Sabine.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A lot's been said on the nature of being a trade envoy and the fact that a special trade envoy role was created for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. And quite rightly, the Minister pointed out that we wouldn't recognise trade envoys today as they were then. He also mentioned the excellent parliamentarian David Heath, who represented Somerton and Frome, which covers part of my constituency. David was a trade envoy when he served in government. And when he was the trade envoy to Nigeria and Angola, the government wouldn't pay for his yellow fever jabs in case he went somewhere else with yellow fever when he wasn't on government business and he derived some private benefit from the jabs and he had to pay for his own. His wife Caroline tells me the only thing he got out of his chips was food poisoning. And so I think that while it would be nice to think there wasn't one rule for some and one for the other, there clearly was, and it's really important that we understand the nature of the brief that Prince Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was given when he became trade envoy, because the others certainly weren't getting massages on the taxpayer. But while this debate concerns Mountbatten Windsor, it's not about one man. It's really about the structural sexism that is embedded in our institutions. Violence against women and girls doesn't persist in this country for a lack of speeches in this chamber. It persists because structurally it's still not treated as foundational to our policy making. There are many members across this House utterly committed to tackling violence against women and girls. Many have dedicated their political lives to this cause, often in the face of horrific abuse. This isn't a party political issue, nor is it about individual commitment. It's about whether the system itself is designed to prioritise women's safety, and too often it's not. Defence is seen as core business, the Treasury is seen as core business, infrastructure is seen as core business. But violence against women and girls is too often siloed, assigned to one minister and under one strategy, as though half the population's safety is a niche concern rather than a central test of whether the state is functioning.
Sure.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does she not agree with me that a powerful illustration of the point she's making is that women and equality as ministerial questions in this place gets just 30 minutes each week, and a very compressed one just before Prime Minister's questions each time?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I'm actually just coming on to give another example of the way in which this sexism is embedded. I recently wrote to both the Minister of Housing and the Minister of Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls to ask why the recent draft National Planning Policy Framework made no mention of women and girls' safety, bearing in mind that this document sets out how we design and build the spaces and places we live in. The response from the MHCOG was jaw-dropping. They said, and I quote, "The NPPF is a planning document. It sets out guidelines for house building and planning in England. The VORG strategy is about protecting women and girls from violence and misogyny. It's unclear as to why anyone would expect the two things to be combined. If it's unclear to the department responsible for planning why violence in women and girls should be considered in their work, then we have a structural problem." And this is where structural sexism becomes inseparable from power, because who makes the decisions matter. In this country, a remarkably small circle of people, disproportionately male, disproportionately drawn from the same networks, still make the most consequential choices.
Would my honourable member give way? Sure. I thank my honourable member friend for giving way when she's making an extremely important point. And on the issue of structural violence against women and girls, would my honourable friend agree with me that it is women and young girls who are the most vulnerable in the face of climate change and those disasters, natural disasters as a result, and exposed to violence, rape against young women and girls when they are displaced from their homes as a result? Now, as trade envoy, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor toured Gulf boardrooms, met alongside Shell executives, energy conglomerates, and that was, ermine royal access diplomacy. So just as in his personal life, he showed no conscience towards those women and young girls of victims and survivors of a convicted paedophile Epstein, in his role as trade envoy, nor did he think about those who were exposed to structural violence of women and young girls also.
Yeah, I totally agree. I couldn't have said it better. The people in these circles appoint one another, they defend one another, and they rehabilitate one another. And sometimes they do so in ways that many women looking on in that situation would not. And when the same small group repeatedly decides what's reputationally survivable, what's politically convenient, and what's worth overlooking, women's confidence in our institutions erodes, which is how this circles back to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Because the issue isn't only his personal conduct. It's about cultures of deference, it's about protective networks, and it's about systems where rehabilitation for powerful men can move faster than justice or safety for women, which is precisely why transparency matters. When decisions are taken within small, powerful circles, sunlight is not a luxury, it's a safeguard. If Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was appointed and maintained as a special trade envoy, then the public is entitled to understand how that decision was reached, what advice was given, what risks were assessed, and who signed it off. We cannot say we are serious about accountability while withholding the very documents that will allow this House and the public to scrutinise how power was exercised. Releasing all correspondence, risk assessments and internal advice relating to his role as trade envoy is not about political point scoring. It's about restoring trust, because transparency is the antidote to institutional deference, and without it, structural sexism continues to operate behind closed doors.
Helen Maguire.
Yeah. So it's... Are you sure?
As I start to contribute to this debate, I do have to pause to pay tribute to all the young women who have risked so much to stand up and push for justice over the vile and corrupt web around the paedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein and the crimes and abuse they suffered as children. But turning to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and the motion before us today, transparency about the workings of an organisation is a key way to prevent corruption. Sunlight really is the best disinfectant. And appreciating that there is an ongoing police investigation that mustn't be jeopardised, Green MPs support the motion in the name of the Liberal Democrats, whilst noting the Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton's apology for defending Andrew Mountbatten Windsor as doing an excellent job whilst in office in 2011 and the reasons he gave for that. This is when Paul Flynn, the formidable late former MP for Newport West, held his debate in the House in 2011 that other members have referred to. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the royal family is sheltered from scrutiny in too many ways, and it's very, very clear now what a risk this can pose. We have heard many examples of MPs facing restrictions and limits on what we can ask about royal activity, but it is reasonable and right that we should scrutinise any work they do on the country's behalf in the fullest way possible, and we look at how these restrictions can be removed and others. Now, as I understand it, Section 37 of the Freedom of Information Act exempts communications between relevant authorities and members, not just the King, but wider members of the royal family, from being released under Freedom of Information requests. Now, that really is one rule for the rich and powerful and one rule for the rest of us, as the Minister condemned earlier. And I believe this is a serious transparency loophole for royals that must be closed. For example, it could mean that if positions such as trade envoy are filled by members of the royal family, it would be, predictably, significantly harder for the press, public and MPs to make sure things are above board, and much harder to get details when things go very, very badly wrong. One example of the effect of this on transparency is in today's Guardian, where there's a profile of the author Andrew Lowney, who's the author of a biography of Andrew called Entitled, and he talks about the stacks he has of rejected freedom of information requests from different government departments. This is why this humble address is so important, as it would uncover whether these restrictions in the FOI Act were in fact part of the equation in making the appointment. I have tabled early day motion 2769, which now has support from MPs of 6 political parties, calling for the King to release all communications between members of the royal family and the paedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein. But obviously that is just the start of what is needed. I'm very grateful for the motion today. If reports are correct that the royal family were aware of concerns about Andrew's financial dealings ahead of his appointment, there are serious questions about whether and how that knowledge matches the King's statement following Mountbatten Windsor's arrest, suggesting he had only recently learned about his brother's misconduct. And it is reasonable to raise these questions too and find out what advice was given from the palace at the time, including as suggested by the current King, for or against the appointment. And I want to add that reactive cooperation with any investigation cannot be enough on the royal family's part. That suggests waiting to be asked by the police, whereas the royal family could be proactively checking its records and visitor logs. It could be speaking to palace and Royal Lodge staff to encourage them to share information with the authorities. And it could be making sure there is an effective whistleblowing policy within the palace. We also need to be able to scrutinise the exact provenance of the £12 million payout from Andrew to the brave late Virginia Giuffre. So to conclude, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor should never have been a trade envoy for this country, but that is not the only matter that requires urgent transparency. His relationship with the child trafficker Jeffrey Epstein has turned the nation's stomach, and we also need to know who in the royal household knew what and when, as well as what he did when he was trade envoy. As part of ensuring that, I hope the Minister will make it clear today that royal freedom of information exemptions that have for too long allowed their power to act in the shadows, concealing important truths from MPs and the public, also need to go.
Helen Morgan. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm one of a handful of MPs on these Liberal Democrat benches and on the current government benches who was elected in the wake of a political scandal. Yeah. In my case, in December 2021, a financial scandal followed by a cover-up by the then Conservative government trying to get one of their own off the hook. And then in the midst of that by-election, there was revelations about Partygate, where it emerged that the Prime Minister had concluded at the time, the Prime Minister of the time, had concluded that there was probably a number of rules that the people in this country that were subject to that didn't apply to him. And I can remember very, very clearly knocking on doors during that by-election and feeling the anger of my constituents that a small group of elite people had concluded that there was rules that applied to them that didn't apply to the people at the top of our society. And I think they would have described that as entitlement. And that's why this debate today is so important, because we must, to restore the trust of the people who voted for me and for those other people who were elected in the wake of by-elections following scandals, and the wider British public, we need to tell them that we've learnt those lessons about political scandal, about cover-up, about entitlement, and are taking actions to restore their trust in what this House is up to and what the wider establishment is allowed to get away with. It's so important to hold the powerful to account. And since then, we've had another of other scandals which have destroyed trust in politics. We've had the VIP lane for COVID contracts. We've had the treachery of Nathan Gill. And we've had the concerns surrounding the appointment of Peter Mandelson. Now, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was intimately involved with Jeffrey Epstein, and we've learned in recent weeks that the relationship was probably much more deep than we first thought and continued much longer than maybe we first thought. And this association with one of the most despicable paedophiles in history at the heart of the British establishment is absolutely poisonous. The victims and survivors of Epstein's crimes must have been re-traumatised many times over the year by the complicity of all those who were closely associated with him and did nothing to bring his crimes to public awareness and bring him to account. I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. She makes a really important point about people who are victims of crimes perpetrated by people in the public eye, because it's particularly difficult for them, because it's almost like the trauma is repeated again and again when these things come to light, and obviously they're in the press and the media. Would you agree with me that we need to particularly support victims who are victims of crimes of this nature?
You make an excellent point, and I can't imagine what it must have been like to be one of those victims or one of those survivors, and to see repeatedly over the years the establishment closing ranks around those that knew him and telling us everything was okay. And he's entirely right. This whole process must be extremely painful for everyone involved, and we should put them at the first and foremost of everything we do as we go forward.
On that point,
I'll give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. One of the things that I've been struck by is that as we hear more and more and more revelations, I think it's quite difficult for some members of the public to keep up. And for many of them, particularly a number of women, they'll want to turn away from what they see on their screens. Does my honourable friend agree with me that as we see what is unfolding in front of our eyes is a conspiracy of silence, where horrific acts were allowed to take place in the shadows, and increasingly we are seeing the arms of the British state were either protected, facilitated or colluded with these horrific acts by people in power? Does she agree with me that this House must make the boldest statement it can that we will not rest until every single stone is unturned?
Helen Morgan. Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. She puts it better than I could. She's entirely right. Because what we have seen here is complicity by people at the heart of the British establishment who we are in the right place to hold to account, but people as part of the international establishment, either turning a blind eye to the act of Jeffrey Epstein or possibly being implicated by them. We don't know that for sure yet. But those who did turn a blind eye must have known. They must have known what was going on. It isn't normal for an older businessman to be surrounded by young teenagers all of the time, to be receiving massages and all sorts of other, as we know, terrible involvements, and for other people to think that that was somehow normal or acceptable or even admirable, as we heard Donald Trump say. Some of those girls were on the younger side, as if that was something to be applauded. It was appalling. Those people must have known, and if they chose not to look, they are part of the problem. The decades-long cover-up, as I've said, must have compounded and worsened the trauma that those women, they were children at the time, compounded the trauma that they suffered. So first and foremost, let's put the victims first. and let's allow the police investigations to go ahead. But we need to look at the wider elements of the scandal as well. As we've heard...
Does she give way?
I will.
I'm extremely grateful to her. Does she share my worry, though, that as it currently stands, the potential for human trafficking, which is at its core what those victims would have been the victims of, is actually not subject to a police inquiry currently? And would she, recognising, of course, that the police will make their own decisions, that is absolutely right, does she not agree that it is for this government to make sure they've got all possible resourcing that they might need, so that if they wanted to go down that particular rabbit hole, and I would urge them to do so actively, that they wouldn't be stymied by any lack of resource in that?
Well, my honourable friend makes a really important point, actually. I will allow.
Urge honourable members not to speculate about what the police might or might not be investigating.
Thank you very much. I thank the Minister for that reminder. I have been astounded, I have to say, by the brilliance of the British media and the journalists who have sifted through thousands and thousands of documents from the Epstein files and uncovered a scandal within a really, really short period of time that has rocked the British establishment to its heart and has got everybody in this place acting to try and uncover the appalling rot at the heart of the Epstein circle. And yet other jurisdictions who've been sitting on those thousands of documents for potentially decades have apparently had no curiosity whatsoever. And that in itself, I think, speaks volumes. I was going to say that the Polish government has launched an investigation into Epstein's links with Russia and his links with both Peter Mandelson and Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor must be causing enormous concern in the light of that development. And so I think it's right now that we seek transparency into the appointment of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor to this role. Because, as my honourable friend has just said, this wasn't about one mistake that led to an individual in an inappropriate position. This has been about a failure of an entire establishment to exercise curiosity, to undertake due diligence, and to put aside its, as an accountant we would call it, our professional scepticism, to put that aside and carry on with that appointment regardless, because that was an entitled person who needed a role. And so it's really, really important now, and I'm pleased that the government have agreed to comply with the request in this humble address and publish those documents. It's really, really important because the public need transparency. They need to understand quickly what's happened and, crucially, what can be done in future to prevent such an appointment happening again. They need to have their trust restored, and they need to have their trust in this place restored, that we care enough to hold those powerful people to account and to make sure that we are always improving public life and not slipping backwards. The humble address itself seeks answers as to how a man with such a questionable reputation came to be appointed to represent the British state. But the debate today has highlighted the impenetrable networks of privilege that for decades have protected a paedophile and those who surrounded themselves with him, possibly for their own gain, and with total disregard for the victims of his crimes and the wider public to whom they were apparently indifferent. The government, when it came to power, promised to clean up British politics. There is a real moment of opportunity for them to demonstrate now that they are serious about that mission, and I hope they take that opportunity, and I hope they do this job properly.
Ian Solemn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This last week has been, by any measure, an extraordinary one in British public life. Within 5 days, 2 people have been arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. One, a former member of the royal family. The other, a veteran Labour politician who was simultaneously, we now understand, the man who championed the first's appointment to his public role in the first place. Now, this motion is not an attempt to prejudice a police investigation. We are clear, let the police do their work. That investigation must proceed on its own terms, free from political interference. But the criminal law and parliamentary accountability are not the same thing, and they have never been mutually exclusive. Parliament has its own duty to scrutinise public appointments, to follow public money, and ensure that the institutions of state are answerable to the people they serve. That duty did not disappear when Thames Valley Police opened their case files. So let us ask the question that this House should have been asking for years. How did Andrew Mountbatten Windsor come to be appointed as Britain's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment in 2001? And what did those responsible for that appointment know? Because here is what we do know. His appointment was, by multiple accounts, controversial from the start. Concerns were raised within government, within the Foreign Office, and reportedly within the royal family itself. And yet he was appointed. For a decade, he travelled the globe on the public purse, meeting heads of state and billionaires, with expenses described by former officials as lavish and poorly scrutinised, effectively given a rubber stamp. And all the while, his relationship with Epstein deepened. A relationship that the Epstein files now suggest may have been entangled with his official duties in ways that potentially breach both his duty of confidentiality and even the Official Secrets Act. The documents that might answer these questions should by now be in the National Archives under the 20-year rule. They are not. Every available exemption has been deployed to keep them sealed. National security, international relations, and more. Some, we are told, are locked away until 2065. Most of us in this chamber would not be here to read them if they were. As the member for Argyll and the member for Brighton Pavilion, who's no longer in her place, have already raised, the historian Andrew Lowney has spent years attempting to access these files through the proper channels. When asked what he made of this, he said simply, "Every single reason has been deployed to stop these papers getting out. You have to ask why." Madam Deputy Speaker, we are asking why. Now, at this point, some may ask, if Parliament has had the tools to scrutinise this through a substantive motion, why is this happening only now? And it's a fair question. No party in over a decade successfully used the parliamentary mechanisms available to force this issue properly. Not because the rules prevented it, but because the cultural gravitational pull of deference was so strong that sustained rigorous scrutiny of a public figure who happened to be a member of the royal family felt, to too many people, like it simply wasn't the done thing. The unwritten convention was as powerful, if not more powerful, than the written rule. That aspect is not a procedural failure, it is a failure of political culture. And it is precisely that culture that this motion challenges today. Now, I came to this place with a background in science, and in any field of systemic inquiry, there is an important principle. You cannot correct a failure you refuse to examine. Institutional failures do not disappear when you look away from them. They compound. The question of how Andrew Mountbatten Windsor came to be appointed, against objections reportedly raised from multiple directions, and how he was then allowed to operate for a decade with expenses rubber-stamped and minimal oversight, is not ancient history. It is the context in which every subsequent failure of public appointment standards must be understood. Beyond this motion, the Liberal Democrats are calling for structural reforms that match the scale of what has been revealed so far. We want a genuinely independent ethics advisor, able to initiate investigations, not waiting for permission from the ministers they are supposed to scrutinise. We want an office of the whistleblower with real legal protections, so that the civil servant who was overruled when they tried to question an expenses claim has somewhere to go. We want a rigorous, transparent, confirmatory process for all significant public appointments, with proper parliamentary involvement from the outset, not as an afterthought, not after the damage has already been done. And we want to see an end to government by WhatsApp. All official business, on the record, all lobbying published, no more deals done in the dark. Madam Deputy Speaker, deference is not respect, silence is not discretion, and secrecy in public life is not safety. It is the condition under which misconduct flourishes. The documents we are asking for today should have been in the public domain years ago. This House has the power and the responsibility to require their release, and it should do today. Thank you.
Yeah. Luke Taylor, I know you're in a lot of pain, Luke.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and you'll have to forgive me for my dancing around to aid my pain back. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Full quote from 1887 by British historian Lord Acton, and it explained how power in its most essential form inevitably corrupts. And I think we discuss here today how that absolute power, that feeling of invincibility, has led to the behaviour that we are all so utterly disgusted about around the chamber. I speak on behalf of all residents who've been in touch with me over the last few weeks, whether you are a Republican, a monarchist, ambivalent to the general principle. What we see is a scandal that is not just engulfing Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but also dragging in the integrity of the wider royal family, because, as has been raised by the Honourable Member for Brighton Pavilion so correctly, we have to ask who knew what and when. What was known about the £12 million that was paid out to Virginia Guthrie in 2022? And how was that allowed to be used to settle a civil suit of allegations of Andrew's offences? Alleged offences, I should say. How was that allowed to happen in the first place? As my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston and Surbiton, has already said, we've seen one friend of Epstein lobbying for a job for another friend of Epstein, and then a 12-year relationship that benefited them both financially and has now resulted in the two arrests for misconduct in public office. This humble address talks about how that began, and I think it is absolutely the right place to start. As a politician coming here, trying to convince the public that we are there to serve, we are there to represent them, that the conspiracies they read in the darker reaches of the internet are nonsense, and that there isn't an elite paedophile ring that runs the world's institutions, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when actually we see these links in the files that go directly from the Kremlin to the White House and everywhere in between, including the British royal family. We talk about standards in public life, we talk about integrity. It's very difficult to maintain if not only that is known and the information in those files is understood by the public, but that then we're unable to scrutinise, we're unable to bring people to this place to ask questions about what has happened. So as discussed, this humble address covers quite a narrow set of papers that surround the appointment as the Special Envoy to the UK trading industry. However, I think we've all discussed as well the parliamentary gymnastics that has been required to get a discussion of outrageous misdeeds allegedly conducted by that man to be discussed in this chamber. And it's those parliamentary gymnastics that I think we have to call out as being so outrageously an outrageous impediment to what our jobs are in this very chamber that we need to dispel from this place entirely. We talk about as well the implications of Andrew and his line of his position in the line of succession. I think at the time that the photos were published of him walking in New York with Jeffrey Epstein in 2011, he was fourth in line to the throne. We talk now of his position, but at the time that that scandal was occurring, how close he was to the throne. It's disgusting. I think I'm going to ask the Minister specifically if he can give us an update on legislation that the government might bring forward to remove Andrew from the line of succession. We speak about, I think he's 8th in the line now, and maybe not such a worry, but the principle of that position to our head of state is obnoxious in the extreme, and I'd like to hear if he's got any update.
Give way.
Absolutely.
I think people just find this. We understand we have a living, breathing constitutional democracy that grows as society better understands things. But it just makes no sense, does it? That if the king doesn't want him to be a prince, it makes no sense that we have to still bring legislation in order to strip him of his dukedom and his earldoms, and equally that he remains in the line of succession and could potentially be a king. Now, yes, we've got plenty of other things we need to be getting on with, but there's a certain logic here that just needs tidying up, if nothing else.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I completely agree. I also want to thank the Minister for his very early acknowledgement of the support for the humble address today, and I also think that he has engaged constructively with comments about its scope, about exactly what it says, and I think that that has been done in and broadly around the chamber, very much a supportive attitude. So I do thank him for that. I'm just going to return to the point about the negative privilege, that we cannot speak freely and have had to use this gymnastic approach to get to the point that we're at today. I've submitted a number of UQ requests to the Speaker's office, who has absolutely understandably not managed to get to justify a discussion of the scandal as it has unfolded, but the necessity that we've had to take to phrase it in the sense of an examination of the Prince's arrangements and his use of property and all sorts of confusing attempts to not then discuss it as we've mentioned around the chamber today has precluded us from doing.
I hate to add to his anguish, but there is a convention in the House that we don't refer to urgent question requests that we've put through to the Speaker.
And I will apologise for breaking that, but I think it is a useful demonstration, however rightfully and with such utter wisdom that we will never question, that the Speaker chooses. Again, it's that challenge to raise issues of this type in the chamber. I will move to close, thank you. Specifically now, and I think the Liberal Democrat benches have been pretty clear on this throughout the afternoon, we have to have a full statutory inquiry into the whole Epstein affair and the tentacles that it has inserted into our public life. We must allow those criminal investigations to be completed, but that investigation must be able to compel witnesses and required to give evidence under oath and to produce documents and other evidence. This must be used not only to punish those who have been complicit and have been involved in the heinous crimes that we've heard about and seen about in the media, who again, and I will reflect other colleagues' comments about the incredible work that the media and journalists have done in investigating these crimes and pouring through those files, I really do think that that cannot be overstated at the effort that they've taken on that. So just to conclude, we do have to ensure that the events that have transpired over the last 20, 30 years from Epstein's scandal can never be repeated, and that the investigation must allow us to fireproof our constitution from similar events ever happening again.
I was going to call Ollie Glover, but I wasn't sure whether the Minister wanted to do that next. But I'll call Ollie Glover.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, this motion is first and foremost about the victims of the appalling crimes of Jeffrey Epstein and his many associates, as well as the importance of protecting people from abuse of power. But it also has significant implications for wider political culture. As my honourable friend, the member for North Shropshire, articulately outlined, this and previous governments have been racked by scandal of many kinds. And this whole Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor affair adds to that by making a very significant contribution to already severe erosion of trust in our politics and institutions. And that is why we are calling for a public inquiry into all aspects of UK and British citizen involvement with Jeffrey Epstein over many years. Now, that inquiry would include, of course, taking account of police and criminal investigations, disclosure and publication of relevant documents. But we must go further. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Many people are talking about the different elements that could be examined during an inquiry. I've even heard some people saying that an inquiry could become too big and take too long. Would he agree with me that there is precedent in this country of having public inquiries in 2 or more parts, and that that is a particular structure that the government and government ministers, who I hope would be listening, would consider in order to make sure that some parts of the inquiry that we need to see urgently looked at could happen sooner rather than later?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I think she makes a very practical proposal for how an inquiry could be conducted efficiently with appropriate prioritisation, so that the most urgent matters get looked at rather than being bogged down in something that would take much longer. But we must go further. We must also toughen the penalties for breaching the ministerial code. We must create an office of the whistleblower to both protect and to empower and encourage people with valuable information to come forward and to speak up. I also support our calls for an end to negative privilege protections, which have prevented criticism of individuals in the royal family in this House for the reasons that we have heard today in this debate.
Would you give way on that point?
I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. What strikes me as I've listened to this excellent debate actually this afternoon is that everything that our establishment sort of depends on is that the people at the heart of it are nice, trusted, good sorts who won't step out of line, and we don't have the mechanisms in place to challenge when that doesn't turn out to be the case. Would he agree with me that the points that he's outlining about Office of the Whistleblower and other statutory bodies to put a code around our behaviour in this place and in wider public life is so important, so that we don't just rely on people being good blokes? Ollie Glover.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I very much agree. There is far too much in British political and wider culture that does rely on taking things on trust and assuming that good motives and good intentions will win the day. Very sadly, the whole affair of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor shows that we cannot necessarily rely on that, and that we do need strong processes and procedures and protocols to make sure that we have the highest standards in public life. Madam Deputy Speaker, we all hope that the necessary changes to prevent a repeat of the whole Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor affair and abomination and the wider Epstein disgrace can be made within the structures of our current system of constitutional monarchy. Should that prove not to be the case, then we risk that calls for a change to our constitutional arrangements grow louder and more compelling.
Ben Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, before I turn to the wider implications of this debate, it's really important to acknowledge why the Liberal Democrats have pressed for full transparency today. Serious allegations have been raised about Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor's conduct during his time as the UK's trade envoy. including reports that he claimed taxpayer-funded expenses for so-called massage services and other inappropriate costs. Former senior officials have described a culture of deference in which such claims were barely even questioned, expenses were rubber-stamped, and scrutiny was effectively absent. I will give way.
Honourable friend for giving way. We rightly say that no one in the country is above the law, and recent weeks have reinforced that principle. Surely it must also be true that no one is above our democratic. So do you think the government should now consider bringing the royal household within the scope of Freedom of Information Act to strengthen confidence in our institution?
I thank my honourable friend for making that powerful point, and I think it's a really important consideration that I hope the Minister is listening to and can respond to today. These concerns naturally lead to further questions. What did those around Andrew Mountbatten Windsor know? What did police protection officers, civil servants, officials who accompanied him and travelled with him, were present during these official duties? What did they observe? What did they record? What did they raise? And crucially, what was dismissed and what was ignored? These are not just trivial matters. They speak directly to how an individual in public office was able to behave in ways that would never be tolerated from anyone else, and how the institutions around him completely and seemingly failed to act.
Just on that point,
We'll give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And just on this point about what the protection officers knew, for example, does it not show the outrageous power imbalance between a royal and an employee, and how the fact that you have someone in that situation who then has to, and we're talking about whistleblowing, we're talking about reporting what has been seen. Does it just not show how outrageous that even the prospect of having someone in that situation is, that they are then being held to account for not calling out the behaviour of someone whose position, whose privilege, whose kind of birthright has put them into such a position? Does he agree that this just shows how our constitution and our structure has put us into such an outrageous twist, and how difficult it's going to be to unwind that?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. I completely agree with him, and I suspect this is just a small start on something that's much, much wider, and I imagine there's probably much more information on that to come. As the House turns its attention to the matter of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, I also want to use this moment to refocus our minds on those who have been most consistently forgotten throughout all of this, the victims and survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and the justice they've been denied for far too many years. It's only because of their bravery in coming forward that we know the true extent of Epstein's crimes and the deeply troubling implications that those crimes hold for our own establishment, as has just been mentioned. Madam Deputy Speaker, when we talk of these survivors, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. Many UK victims are simply too afraid to come forward right now. Their fear is well documented in UK reporting, which describes a greater sense of fear and reticence among British survivors, fear of stigma, fear of being disbelieved, fear of the powerful networks that have long silenced these women and girls. And yet abuse did happen here in the UK. Epstein carried out wrongdoing during extensive and repeated trips to London. These weren't distant or abstract harms. They took place here on UK soil under UK jurisdiction, and so they demand a UK-led response. But instead of justice here at home, victims were effectively steered, and are still steered, Madam Deputy Speaker, into a US justice system. They're told to seek redress through the Epstein Victims Compensation Programme and a fund that ultimately paid $120 million to around 135 survivors, and did so more quickly and confidentially than litigation could. Now, that programme has been open internationally, and victims here in Britain could apply without needing a lawyer, making it less costly and less traumatic. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, what does it say about our own UK justice system when British victims who are abused here on British soil are left seeking justice 4,000 miles away? When we ask traumatised people to navigate foreign bureaucracies because we here in the United Kingdom have nothing equivalent to offer them? And what does it say that only less than a handful of UK victims even approached a solicitor? Not because abuse didn't happen, we know that it did, but because the absence of any UK prosecution meant they didn't feel empowered to speak. We can draw a stark contrast between figures like Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, Peter Mandelson, who have allegedly enriched themselves through their associations with the survivors who are left fighting for justice. What the Epstein files reveal is a powerful network of wealthy people colluding with Epstein, using their privilege to silence and dismiss survivors, a pattern which has been highlighted by the End Violence Against Women coalition. This exposes how powerful men evade consequences while their victims struggle even to be heard, reinforcing the very fear that continues to keep British survivors in the shadows. Surely the role of this House, of any democratic institution worth its name, is not simply to just reinforce that silence, but to finally break it. And that's why today we call clearly and firmly for the UK to open criminal prosecution and survivor-led inquiries into London-based offences. These alleged crimes fall squarely within the UK jurisdiction. The offender's nationality is irrelevant. The victim's nationality is irrelevant. What matters is that the harms occurred here, and those harmed deserve justice here. Justice for British victims must not be outsourced abroad. Justice must not be dependent on the bravery of a handful willing to defy enormous pressure. Justice must not be conditional on navigating a foreign compensation scheme. Justice should be delivered transparently, confidently and compassionately here in Britain.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with me that having a public inquiry would be a very public way for the British authorities, for the state, to show those survivors that they have been the victim of some heinous crimes, and that it would give them more confidence to come forward? And we know that survivors of all kinds of sexual abuse and rape across this country, whether it be part of some big scandal like Mohammed Al-Fayed or Epstein, or whether it be something much more local and individual, all of them will be being re-traumatised again and again and again by seeing this splashed across the front pages of the papers and all over the media day after day after day. And we have to make a stand and say enough. We will not tolerate this in this country, and we have to stand up to these powerful men who silence their victims and ensure that they have to fight for justice every step of the way.
Yeah. I thank my honourable friend for that excellent intervention. I couldn't agree more that a public inquiry is very much needed to expose all of the harms that have been done to these victims and how the establishment of our country have seemingly played such a central role in that. Madam Deputy Speaker, if our government is sincere when it speaks of a fairer, safer and more accountable society, it must now show leadership rather than continued deference. It must show survivors they will be believed, protected and heard in the UK, because at the heart of this matter are not titles, reputations or institutions, but people. Survivors whose lives, like the victims of domestic abuse, have been shaped by fear, by silence and by power wielded against them rather than for them. They deserve far better. They deserve a justice system that will fight for them. And now is the time for immediate action. So please, will the Minister consider not redacting any of the documents which don't relate to the ongoing police investigation? Will the government look at, as my honourable friend has just suggested, a public inquiry, a full public inquiry into Epstein and his links to the British establishment? And finally, will the Minister please go away and look to end the appalling negative privilege which prevents MPs in this House from speaking freely about members of the royal household? This is a disgusting symptom of the deference we have shown to those in positions of power at the cost of victims. Our constituents should no longer be silenced in what should be our proud British democracy. Thank you.
Yeah. I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Lisa Smart.
Very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we've had an extremely powerful debate today, and I'll address a number of the points that have been raised. But I want to start by talking about how the revelations of recent weeks and recent months have been shattering for the British public and deeply, deeply distressing for many of those directly impacted. We've listened to the gut-wrenching stories of abuse endured by vulnerable women and girls, and we were reminded by my colleague, the member for North East Fife, that we are in many cases talking about children here. We've learned of the arrogance and cruelty of rich, powerful men who felt that no rules applied to them and who made a mockery of our values and our laws. And we have seen laid bare the hollowness of a political establishment that was manipulated so easily and who treated state secrets like cheap gossip. Public trust has been catastrophically undermined by the Epstein saga, and we are now at a crossroads in our public life. If Parliament does not act with courage, faith in our institutions will suffer even more permanent harm and will remain under intense public suspicion and unease. To start to repair the damage, we must uncover the full and unvarnished truth. Critical to that process is demanding that every relevant department comes clean and shares what was known about Mountbatten Windsor's appointment as Special Representative for Trade and Investment, about what concerns were raised ahead of his appointment if his suitability came into question, and what risks were identified throughout that process. The British people deserve to know what behaviour was tolerated and by whom, and they deserve to... I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, because on that point I have a constituent who contacted me who played a public role in the Middle East, and during that role they said they had to go through incredible checks, background checks, etc. And obviously the release of these files would enable us to see actually if the same background checks that are applied to people in public life, you know, to citizens like us, are also applied to the royal family. Does my honourable friend agree?
So I'm grateful to my honourable friend's intervention, also to her constituent who's contacted her about this really important point. My view and the view of the Liberal Democrats is that we should get to the bottom of how this role was created, the vetting that was done before the appointment, to understand the extent of that vetting or the lack of the extent of that vetting. If somebody is being paid by the public purse, they should be held to an extremely high standard, and there should be transparency about their role and the creation of that role to begin with. So I very much agree with her. The public deserve to know if sections of their government of its time put in place systems to shield Mountbatten Windsor from accountability, even at a cost to the national interest. Now, of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the police must undertake their work unimpeded. And of course, anybody who has committed a crime should face justice if they are found to have committed that crime. But a police investigation, no matter what prosecution it leads to, is not enough. It is essential for the strength of our constitution and our social fabric that we go further and clean up the broken system that facilitated this scandal in the first place.
On that point,
with pleasure.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. One of the points that's been raised this afternoon is that even whilst the police go ahead with their investigations, there is still a job for this House to do. And it strikes me that some of the most basic principles that we assume in this place and when we come to this place are really being questioned. And I just wonder if she would agree with me that it is worth restating for the record and for the public that there are certain principles in public life that this case is highlighting we have to make sure remain in place, that no one is above the law, that taxpayers' money and public office must be used for the public interest and not for private gain, that Parliament has not just the right but the duty to hold the powerful to account and to pursue all means of transparency, and that ultimately all powerful people must face a reckoning if they were involved in this scandal.
Yeah. I wholly agree with my honourable friend. She's made a number of very powerful interventions throughout this debate. This whole sorry saga repeatedly brings up arrogant, greedy men, mostly men, who have behaved in a way that has sought to enrich them further and increase their power.
Just on that point.
With pleasure.
I hope this adds to her point, because does she find the irony that the only person who has been imprisoned as part of the Epstein scandal is a woman?
He is not the only person to refer to structural sexism in this debate, and I think particularly my colleague and honourable friend, the member for Frome and East Somerset, made an extremely powerful speech about how we could, should we choose to do so as a Parliament, embed looking at sexism, at violence against women and girls, in our policy making, in our thinking, in a way that would benefit the whole of society. And I'm grateful for him raising the point that there remain many people for whom the hand of justice is yet to seek them out with the full vigour with which it should. We should be pulling back the curtain on Andrew's use of the special envoy role and the whole system around him on the power he had in an official state-sanctioned position, and on the many opportunities missed for scrutiny and accountability, not least, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this place. A number of members across both sides of the House have talked about the importance of pace and of speed. I think the member for Sherwood Forest made a very good point that I think he raised earlier this week to the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister about making sure we get on with some of this. And indeed, the Father of the House reminded us that the wheels of justice often grind slowly. My friend, my deputy leader indeed, and the member for St Albans gave some really practical solutions about how we can make sure progress continues at pace, to make sure that one thing isn't holding up another. And indeed, the Shadow Minister reminded us that police involvement in this should not unduly delay the whole of the process. It is, of course, an absolutely vital part that the police should be free to do their job and do it well, but that should not unduly hold up the release of the information we are seeking. We Liberal Democrats very much welcome support from across the Chamber for our motion today, including from the Treasury bench. And I wonder when he's winding up if the Minister could confirm, like when the government was responding to the previous humble address that we discussed in this place, that information will be released when it is available, that is, any information will be released when it's available, only holding back that information that is directly relevant to a police investigation. And I'd be grateful if he could do that when he's on his feet in a few moments.
On that point,
please go ahead.
I'm great.